Howdy doody buckaroonies. And welcome back to another episode of Morning Coffee with Cameron. Today, we are here for what is probably the top requested synth and gear demo on this channel ever. We're going to be talking about this thing. The ASM Hydrasynth. Fun fact about the Hydrasynth here. Everything you're hearing right now was generated using sine waves. At least sine waves after this thing is done processing them. And I think that's pretty inspiring, that from perhaps the most primitive wave of all, we've created a very rich, brilliant sounding patch. And I'll tell you, I had a hell of a lot of fun doing it. I'm very, very excited to explore this thing with you today. Show you some of my favorite features, talk about my experience with it, and hopefully have a little bit of fun along the way on this sonic adventure. Big shout out to ASM as well for lending this to me for a couple of weeks to try it out. It's been very, very fun. And I think I'm going to be sad to see it go. So, with that, let's dive in. And explore this thing. I've been wanting to get a hold of the Hydrasynth here for a while now. I first heard about the Hydrasynth at KnobCon, and I believe this was shortly after it was initially announced, and I was pretty hyped to be able to play with it, but unfortunately there was no one from ASM at the booth to give me a rundown of what this thing was capable of. At this time, the hype surrounding this thing was real, and not without good reason. After all, ASM was a really unknown company, and the first product they released is one of the more powerful synths on the market without the ultra premium price tag, while retaining a lot of the more high-end and premium synth features. At NAMM, I got a bit more hands-on time with the Hydrasynth, and I chatted with the ASM rep both about what ASM set out to do and what they wanted to do with their synths, as well as get a bit more of a deep dive into the Hydrasynth and some of its features, especially after some of the later firmware updates came out. There were some new things it did that were pretty exciting and pretty interesting. However, NAMM being NAMM, and NAMM being filled with people like this, it was pretty hard for me to accurately judge the sonic character of the synth. I'll be honest here, I was not really wowed with the sound demos I heard on YouTube. The Hydrasynth had some really impressive patches and some really, really cool features, but the sound just wasn't quite there for me. However, I was very pleasantly surprised after playing with it the last couple of weeks to be proven entirely wrong about the sound of the Hydrasynth. After a lot of you requested for me to feature this thing here on the channel, as well as watching Bo Beats' excellent video about the Hydrasynth, my interest in this whole thing was renewed. I got in touch with the folks at ASM, and they were kind enough to send me this here Hydrasynth Keys version to try out for a couple of weeks and share my experience with all of you. I also did a couple of live streams with this thing, showing my first impressions right after unboxing it, as well as a live sound design and patch design session. So if you want to check those out, you can find links to those down in the description. It's probably also worth pointing out here that in the comments of one of these live streams, it was brought to my attention by someone who I can only assume is one of the leading authorities in all things of the music industry that I myself am obviously not a musician, so I suppose bear that in mind as we go forward. One other note I think is important to bring up before we dive into some sound demos here. As I mentioned, I personally was not really wowed by the sound of this thing, and I'm guessing that might be due to something weird with the way YouTube compresses audio, so take everything you hear in this video with a little bit of a grain of salt, and I'll just tell you firsthand, this thing is actually surprisingly lush and full sounding, and I guess that may or may not translate in the final version of this video that you're watching. So let's give a few patches a spin here and hear how this thing sounds, shall we? Overall, I think the factory patches on this thing are pretty widely varied, however, it seems very Blade Runner-esque for whatever reason. That said, they do leave a bit to be desired. They're not the most crazy inspiring presets on the face of the earth, but I am glad they're there, and that is for the reason that a lot of them do a very good job of showing off the capabilities of the Hydrasynth and a lot of different things you can do. Some utilize the ribbon controller in different ways. Some show the mutants very well. Some are just great utility sounds to show the overall versatility of the Hydrasynth. So although you will probably end up overwriting a lot of them, the factory patches are useful to scroll through just to get some ideas as to what the synth is capable of. Now, I've created a few patches here that I think represent more of what I like about the Hydrasynth, as well as a few to demonstrate some of the warmer side of the synth, as lots of demos on YouTube seem to focus on the really crazy, heavily modulated side and stuff like that. And while I think that's fun and all, I think it's also important to have a sense of the synth being able to fill out the bread and butter patches that we all need. The Hydrasynth here does also respond to MPE, so I've created a couple very quick MPE patches to demonstrate that as well. The keybed here does support polyphonic aftertouch, but obviously for MPE capabilities you need some kind of MPE controller, so for that I'm using my handy dandy Stencil Morph. And now perhaps for the biggest question of them all, how is the workflow on this thing? For as deep as this synth is, it's actually surprisingly straightforward. As I mentioned, and as you could probably see on the live stream I did, everything is laid out really well and really intuitively, and I feel like I never really needed to open the manual for the synth to understand how to do everything, even some of the more complex features, like using alternative sources to trigger the envelopes or something along those lines. So I think overall that's a pretty good testament to the design and UI and user experience overall for a pretty complicated synth. I kind of expected walking into this to be something more like my Blofeld, which is incredibly powerful, but can be a bit of a nightmare to program and had a bit of a learning curve. This thing is actually very simple, which is great. There is a fair amount of menu diving involved, but we got some big bright displays here, and the layout and controls and all of that and the menu diving experience really seamlessly blend together nicely. So that's great. It doesn't take you out of the patching zone. It doesn't interfere with it, and it doesn't make you question at least too much what is going on. It's usually pretty straightforward. Designing a patch on the Hydrasynth is pretty straightforward. Let's double tap to initialize, and away we go. If we want to select an oscillator, we go to the oscillator buttons here. We can go into single mode, which allows us to play a single cycle waveform. Or we can go into wave scan mode and scan through a wavetable. To generate a wavetable, as you can see here, we've got these 8 little sections, so I can edit my wave list. We can go in here, hold shift, and that'll rotate through all of these very quickly. And we can just make something random by kind of scrolling through here a little bit and seeing what we get. If we're happy with that, we can go to exit and scan through the wave with the wave scan knob here. So maybe that last frame and that first frame are a bit ugly, so we could do something else. And let's try that. Cool, I think that's good enough for me. Now, when it comes to shaping the waves with the various mutants, we get 2 mutants for oscillator 1 and 2 mutants for oscillator 2, no mutants for oscillator 3. We can go to mutant 1 and select them. We've got FM, we've got wave stack, which is like a detuning effect. So kind of a unison thing, more or less. We can go through and do oscillator sync. We can also change the source between oscillator 1, 2, 3, and we can change the ratio as well. That can be kind of fun. Pulse width. And the cool thing is this can be applied to any wave. We got the ratio. Let's set that back to something a bit more acceptable. We've got pulse width squeeze. Almost like a formant sort of thing going on there. And then we have pulse width ASM, which is pretty fun. So right now it's not doing anything, and that's because we go into the edit mode and change the various warp points. So there are 8 individual warp points, and we get a custom pulse width mod. What's particularly crazy about this, though, is we can actually assign these to modulation. So we could have a pulse width effect that is really never the same or never repeating, which is very, very interesting. There are some more interesting effects like harmonic here. A little bit annoying, and then phase difference. Which is pretty fun. That reminds me a lot of something like Vital. In terms of the FM, we can FM from oscillator 1, 2, and 3, and we can FM from a sine or triangle. With the sine and triangle, we can also use the ratio. However, with the oscillators, the ratio doesn't actually do anything. Once we've got something we're cool with, we can move on to the filters. We've got 2 filters here. So filter 1, we've got a bunch of different modes. Let's maybe do kind of a semi-resonant low pass. We've got some quick assignments here for envelope 1, LFO1, velocity, and key track. Filter 2, we could set this up to be one of 2 modes, low pass, band pass, high pass, low pass, notch, and high pass. In this case, we'll just leave this off for the sake of time, but these can be routed in serial or parallel. We've got the amp section. We could add some velocity response to this, to the envelopes, or to the amplifier, as well as to LFO2. In the effects, we could add something here. Let's maybe do kind of gentle chorus. A bunch of different effects here. We've got chorus, flanger, rotary, phaser, lo-fi, tremolo, EQ, compressor, distortion. In these, there are some different modes as well. So in the chorus, for example, we can scroll through chorus 1, 2, and 3. For the delay and reverb, we've got several different modes: basic, mono, basic stereo, pan delay, left, right, center delay, and reverse. Reverse can be quite a bit of fun. Let's maybe just do a super simple stereo delay. Reverb, couple really nice algorithms. Let's crank this up a wee bit. We've got Hall here. Maybe bordering on metallic. We can get decay times up to 90 seconds as well. We've got Room. Pretty smooth and some nice modulation to it. Plate. Smooth, but maybe a bit pingy with the reflections. And then finally we have Cloud, which I believe is a maybe granular delay slash reverb combo. Very smooth overall, besides that initial kind of flutter. After that, we've got the post effects. This is the same as the pre-effects, so we've essentially just got two inserts, one before the delay and reverb and one after. When it comes to making patches, I do also like to go in and turn on the warm mode and add a bit of analog FL here. This just adds some kind of destabilization to the oscillators. A little bit of drift. We can also add stereo width here, which is really nice. I usually set the stereo mode to random, and now it will spread the voices out randomly in the stereo field. So a little bit of that is really effective as well to provide some big wideness to the patch. We've got randomized phase here. We've got poly, mono, mono low, mono high, unison, unison low, unison high. Density goes up to 8, and the detune controls the detuning amount. When it comes to patch design, there are a few cool ideas and tips I figured I would share. One thing to know is that the envelopes are actually loopable. If we go into envelope 3 here, we can go up and down into here. We've got envelope loop, so we can set that to be infinite or control it here. Free running mode, we've got reset, legato. We have control over the attack, decay, and release curves, so that's pretty fun. And then we've also got triggers, so we can have 4 different triggers. So we have note on, we can have other things like the LFOs going on here, ribbon on, ribbon release, sustain pedal on, mod in 1, mod in 2. So those are the CV inputs up here, meaning that these are pretty flexible and they're a lot of fun to mess with, especially when you start messing with the LFOs as different trigger sources. On the note of the envelopes as well, they are extremely long, which is awesome. If we go up here, we can get up to 36 seconds of attack, 60 seconds of decay, 60 seconds of release, and that makes for some very lush modulated pads, especially when we can start looping them or re-triggering them using other sources. One thing of note though is that if we do re-trigger the envelope with something like one of the LFOs, this is actually per cycle of the LFO, so once the LFO cycles through, it sends out a new trigger. This is a little unfortunate in my opinion. I would have really liked this to be based on the amplitude, because then with something like the sample and hold waveform, if it reached the peak amplitude or something like that, it would trigger, which would be maybe more useful for some kind of pseudo-generative patches. On the note of the LFOs, we can also use them as a sequencer. Let's use LFO1 as a basic sequencer here. We'll go into the mod matrix, assign, and we're going to do assign LFO1 to oscillator 1's pitch. We'll increase the value all the way. Go back, let's go into LFO1 here, and there's a mode called step. Now we can go down, we'll turn on semitone lock, we can control the amount of steps. This is up to 64 in total. Let's just do 8 for now because that's nice and easy. We'll go into step edit and we can start creating a sequence. Let's increase the tempo. Go back out here and set this to tempo mode, or just increase the rate. We could BPM sync this to maybe 16th notes. Then if we added a nice tempo sync delay, like a dotted 8th note, for example, we've got A pretty decent patch. Another interesting idea of the Hydrasynth is the macros. So when we're back on the main interface, we've got 8 macros here. These can be assigned to multiple sources. So let's go into macro assign macro 1 here. Let's do the destination as filter 1's cutoff, and that is all good with me. Let's go back out. We've got this at 0. The macros can be assigned to multiple sources. So let's go back into the macro edit, macro 1, assign this to oscillator 1, and change the destination to wave scan. Let's increase that a bit. And now if we go back and move our macro, we'll open up the filter as well as scan through the waveform. Let's maybe drop the mutant down a little bit there, be a bit more obvious. And I think that's actually a really cool idea, and I think that is actually the first time I've seen that done on a hardware synth, and it's actually kind of awesome. The mod matrix is really, really big. We actually get up to 32 slots in total, and in my opinion, this is really where you should spend most of your time to get full advantage of all that the Hydrasynth has to offer. There are a lot of different assignable parameters. We've also got unipolar LFOs, mono aftertouch, poly aftertouch. Assigning MPE parameters is really easy. We've got the ribbon here as well, so we've got ribbon ribbon absolute positive, ribbon relative, expression pedal, mod in 1 and 2, the CV inputs over here, MPEX, MPEY absolute, MPEY relative, MPE off, and then we've got CC. So we've got a handful of MIDI CC things we can use as well in the mod matrix, meaning that overall, this is probably one of the most flexible mod matrices I've ever used on a hardware synth. It is truly an epic mod matrix. One of my favorite things about the Hydrasynth though is the mod matrix and how easy it is to assign, because it's really simple just to go in here, click something, assign. Let's assign LFO2 to oscillator 1, the wave scan by that much, and then let's assign LFO3 to LFO2's rate. And now we've got something more complex. Maybe we could turn off the sequence here as well, because I'm getting a wee bit tired of that. Now, got some pretty decent modulation going on. All without a whole lot of effort, which is nice. One fun feature of the Hydrasynth is the ribbon here. This can be used for pitch bend normally, so if we play something, that's pretty fun and pretty crazy, but it does offer a couple of different modes. If we go to the ribbon control here, we can change the mode to theremin. Let's quantize this, so this is going to be in semitones now. We can also change this to be locked to a scale, so in this case we're E flat. Let's change this to major. That is particularly useful for drone sounds, and I really like that that is an included feature. We can also change this to be mod only, so it won't affect anything pitch-wise. It would only be used as a modulation source, which we can assign in the matrix. We can assign the ribbon to, oh, I guess the filter cutoff once again. So very, very simple and straightforward. That being said, I personally did not find myself using the ribbon all that much in my time with the Hydrasynth. It is a very fun feature and it does feel really good. It's very responsive, but not something I found myself really reaching for or assigning a lot of the time. Sometimes I would use it as a mod source, but really, I could probably get away with not ever using it. It's not something I've ever had before on a synth, so I guess it's just not something I'm used to ever reaching for, but maybe over time it would become something that would be a lot more useful. One thing I do want to point out though, and maybe I need to reread some parts of the manual a little bit on this because I was checking into the ribbon, but after recalibrating it, it didn't seem to be quite perfectly calibrated, and I'm not sure if I was just calibrating it wrong or maybe I just needed to give it another try, but the pitch tracking was a little bit off at times for me. Because the Hydrasynth here has been out for a little while, I don't think it's worth covering all the specs in gory detail, but here are a few key points that I think are worth knowing. When it comes to price, there's the Hydrasynth key version, which I'm using here today, that comes in at $12.99, that's in US dollars. There is also a desktop module available, and that comes in at $7.99, also in US dollars. There are 640 presets in total. There is no user preset area, which I found a little bit odd, so you do have to overwrite the factory presets. Not a huge deal, but just seemed a little bit weird. There are 219 single cycle waveforms available. When you do a wavetable, you get 8 frames, so you can pick any 8 waveforms to combine in different ways, but you cannot import your own. The Hydrasynth has 2 different filters. These can be routed in serial or parallel, and there are 16 different filter types in total. When it comes to effects, the Hydrasynth gives you 9 different effects with a couple of different modes each. There is a pre-effect slot and a post-effect slot. Those can be any effect except delay or reverb. The delay and reverb are fixed in between those 2 effect slots. They are routed in parallel. There are a couple different modes as well for the reverb and the delay, so that's nice. There's a lot of variety on the effects on this thing. When it comes to the mutants for the oscillators, there are 8 different mutants in total. We'll dive into that in a little bit more detail in a while. Those are available for oscillators 1 and 2 only. On the keys version, there is a ribbon controller above the key bed as well. This is really cool. It can be used as a pitch bend, it can be used as a quantized theremin layer, or it could just be used as a mod source, kind of like a mod wheel or something along those lines. Other than that, the Hydrasynth is monotimbral. It does offer MPE support. There are 5 LFOs and 5 different envelopes. There is a mixer section, which also allows you to bring in a noise source and a ring modulator, so that's cool. You can combine that and get a pretty wide palette of sounds. There are 3 oscillators in total. Oscillators 1 and 2 are complex oscillators. These allow you to create wavetables and stuff, as well as take advantage of the mutants. There are 2 mutants on each of those. Oscillator 3, however, is a single cycle, just fixed oscillator. It has no mutants. You can't make it a wavetable, but it can use any of the 219 single cycle waveforms. So how about the build quality here? This is important because after all, this is a pretty expensive synthesizer, so you would want it to feel like one. In case it doesn't quite translate on camera, let me just say that this thing is built like a tank. It's got lots of nice, big, chunky metal knobs with nice clicky action on a few of them, and overall feels like a pretty premium instrument. It's also got these big aluminum end caps and a steel case covering all the guts and jiggly bits. When it comes to the overall feel and weight, the unit itself is surprisingly hefty, and I think would really hold up well if you were traveling or touring with it. The only concern I might have is these paddles for the mod and pitch wheels. While they are surprisingly nice to use, which I thought would be odd given that they're pretty different than anything else I'd ever used, I think they could snap off pretty easy if they were hit the right way because they are plastic. But I think as long as you're careful with it and use common sense, the Hydrasynth here would last for a very long time. For the keys on the keyboard edition, these are really nice to play on and have a very solid feel to them. They aren't overly light and flicky synth action keys, and they have a nice bit of resistance and a good feel overall. The aftertouch though did take me a little bit of getting used to, as I'm used to the more spongy aftertouch of my key lab, but all in all, I think it's a great keybed to play on and offers a pretty premium feel. Speaking of aftertouch, the keybed here actually supports polyphonic aftertouch, which is awesome to see as it's not very common, and I have no idea why. The poly aftertouch really allows you to dig into the power of the Hydrasynth's mod matrix and explore your patches in a lot of new and very expressive ways. To demonstrate this here, I've just got a super basic Poly Aftertouch saw patch. If you don't know what Poly Aftertouch is, basically this should explain it. If you have a regular keyboard and you apply Aftertouch, it applies to everything currently playing. But Poly Aftertouch, on the other hand, we can apply to individual notes because it's on a per key basis. When it comes to the other components, the buttons are nice and clicky. The knobs really feel great, and the main encoder as well as the arpeggiator encoders have some nice clicky action to it. Overall, this is probably built as well as they come. It feels like a very well-made premium instrument. That brings us to one of the more important parts of this here picture show feature-length presentation extravaganza. Let's talk about the pros and cons of this thing. Now, unlike some of my fellow YouTubers, I really don't believe in reviewing something after only having it for a couple of hours. I like to take something out to dinner for a couple weeks and get to know it and put it through its paces and try it out, integrate it into my workflow, and see how it really performs out in the wild in practice. First up, let's talk pros. Overall, the Hydrasynth is an incredibly deep synthesizer, and I think it could keep me busy for a pretty long time, which I think is a very valuable thing. And I think if this was your first synth or kind of the core synth of your setup, it would be a very solid choice. As a sound designer, one of the more important things for me is that a synth or a piece of equipment is very flexible, because in the end, it's just a better investment for me and my money to have something that does a lot of different things rather than a bunch of things that just do one thing. And the Hydrasynth ticks that box very well. It's capable of a whole lot of different sounds and is a pretty fun synth to use overall. It can really generate some stuff I haven't heard before from a hardware synth. One important footnote there, though, is that the Hydrasynth to me isn't a glorified VST in a box, as some people might lead you to believe. I think it is an incredibly powerful piece of hardware that blurs the lines between what you would expect from software and hardware. It's really, really cool and incredibly powerful once you know how to use it. Overall, there were a few wow moments for me, which is pretty rare. There were a couple of times where I would browse through some patches or design something and really kind of stop for a minute to appreciate all that the Hydrasynth is capable of. And I think that alone makes this a pretty impressive little rectangle of stuff. The filters overall sound pretty good. I was surprised that the digital filters had a good character to them, because digital filters, I feel like, sometimes are the weak points of a lot of synthesizers, but the filter models here are really good. I appreciate the variety because that does open up a broader palette of sounds you can construct with the Hydrasynth, and I think with a little bit of filter drive, it sounds pretty excellent. The reverbs on the Hydrasynth are pretty good. They're not great, but they are pretty good, which seems to be sort of a rarity in the synthesizer market. The Novation Peak has a really great reverb, and I think the Hydrasynth holds up against that pretty well. It's not quite as good as the Peak, but I think the variety of the reverbs and different algorithms and the flexibility of them makes them well suited to being used without being like, wow, I wish I had a different reverb to use with this synth. It goes from shorter, useful utility reverbs to really long, ridiculous clouds of reverb that are pretty much what I would want to pair with something like this to begin with. So I think ASM did a really good job selecting and putting together some pretty decent reverb algorithms for this thing. One of the best parts of the Hydrasynth, I think, is that it is capable of some very lush and very modulated sounds, which is something I always really appreciate. I love a good mod matrix, and I think that's really where you should spend most of your time when you're patching your synth patches together. The Hydrasynth ticks that box over and over and over again, from the ridiculously long envelopes to the number of envelopes and LFOs available to the 32 slot mod matrix. There's plenty to explore to enhance and move your patches into new directions without a whole lot of effort. Overall, I really love the build quality of this thing. The Poly Aftertouch keys are awesome. I'm so glad they included that. The knobs and stuff just feel great. All of the components and just overall, the whole thing feels like a very nice synthesizer. I wouldn't be afraid to take it with me. I wouldn't be afraid to travel with it. It's a pleasure to work on, and I do love the design and layout overall. It was really intuitive. Everything is laid out very clearly. Knobs are where you would find yourself to expect them to be. All of the jacks feel nice. There's nothing wiggly or falling apart. The buttons are nice. They're not slacky, clacky, crappy buttons. Everything overall feels like a really high quality component. The UI and experience is great. I feel like I was able to intuitively figure out everything I wanted to do on this thing within only a couple hours of having it. And I think, as just one broad, too long didn't read, it's pretty damn good. Now, let's talk cons of this thing. I could really only come up with a handful, which I think that in and of itself is a pretty big statement as to how nice the Hydrasynth is overall. A couple of these are pretty nitpicky, and I feel like a couple firmware updates, which ASM seems to put out firmware updates pretty regularly, could check all these boxes and make this thing a 11 out of 10. First up, there is no filter FM, at least as far as I could tell, and I think that's a little disappointing. I would have liked to see filter FM on here because I feel like that would be pretty cool and open up some interesting new sound possibilities. On the note of the filters as well, the second filter is a much more simple filter, and perhaps that's a restriction of the processing power of the Hydrasynth. So filter 1 has a lot of different modes that sound really cool. Filter 2 though is just a simple morphing filter, so we have low pass, band pass, high pass, or low pass, notch, high pass. Another thing, and this is really nitpicky, but the mutants, when you're using them, is applying on a global oscilloscope here in the center display. I think it would be nice to change that to where the mutant is coming through on the oscilloscope here, and it shows how you're affecting the oscillator with that mutant. It's not the end of the world, but I think maybe for beginners or for some of the more interesting modes, it would be nice to see how you're affecting the waveform rather than seeing the final output. That just might be kind of cool. Really minor thing, so not the end of the world by any means. One of the bigger downsides, I think, to the Hydrasynth overall is that it is not as immediate to program as some other synthesizers. And this is by no means a bad thing, but I think it is important to manage your expectations when approaching this. Of course, a lot of your basic sounds are very easy. A quick respace, a filtered square lead, or whatever, very straightforward and simple to do, but to really take advantage of all the things that the Hydrasynth can do and all the things it has to offer, you will spend a pretty good amount of time on each patch. So that is something to bear in mind. It's a very complex synthesizer, and there are a lot of features and a lot of things to do, so making really crazy patches does take time. Another thing that I think could be easily fixed with a firmware update, in the mutants, if you're in the FM modes and you're using one of the other oscillators as the FM source, there is still a ratio control, which confused me for a little bit because it doesn't actually do anything. The ratio control only does something when you are using one of the predefined waveforms. So that could probably just be turned off on that mode, I think, just to clear that up. I found myself sitting there twiddling it, wondering why nothing was happening, but not a big deal. Oscillator 3 is a basic waveform, so it's only single cycle, but it does allow you to use complex waveforms. I think maybe in a future Hydrasynth, it would be really cool to see a third complex oscillator, much like what the Novation Peak offers, because I feel like that, combined with the FM capabilities and stuff, could make for some really interesting sounds and open up a couple of new ideas for the Hydrasynth that would be very cool to see. One of the other things I think to know about the Hydrasynth is that it's probably not going to be my go-to synth for big, deep bass sounds. You can get some nice, rich low end out of it, but it's not going to be my first choice for that type of stuff. But as with, I guess, the modal Argon 8 I recently talked about on the channel, that's not really a fault of the synth, that's just something I guess I would expect from it. This being a digital synth and with a lot of complex moving parts and bits and bobs, I would think is more well suited to leads, pads, that kind of stuff, and not, you know, traditional big, thick, low bass sounds. But not really the end of the world. I feel like with a little bit of post-processing, you could get some nice, thick sounds out of this. One of the other things to know about the Hydrasynth is it probably wouldn't be my first choice for big bass sounds. The low end maybe leaves a bit to be desired compared to something like the Novation Peak, but with a little bit of post-processing, that's totally fine. As I would probably expect from something like this, you know, being a digital wave morphing, wave scanning synth, it's going to be more well suited to leads, pads, drones, textures, crazy FM soundscapes, and things like that. So basically to be expected. One thing that sort of bothered me a little bit is, as far as I can tell, the envelopes can't be individually velocity controlled. It's just a global application of velocity to all of the envelopes. So that might be a cool thing to add in a future firmware update so that each envelope can have different velocity sensitivity, because I feel like that would add some really interesting dimensions to a couple of patch ideas. Finally, to round off the cons here, it's really not the thickest, fullest sounding synthesizer I've ever heard, but that's kind of what I expected going into it. Like I said at the beginning though, I was very wrong about how this thing sounds. I think overall, it's a very good sounding synthesizer. It's not this huge, full, lush, crazy thing, but it does everything so well and packs in so many ridiculous features that I personally don't care. And especially in the context of a mix, it really doesn't matter anyway. So not really a con, but something to know. Okay, so now I want to take just a minute to answer some of the most common viewer questions I was asked during the streams and on Discord, just to cover all of that now that I've had some time with this thing and a little bit of time to think. Question number 1, is it worth buying just as a Poly Aftertouch keyboard? And I think the answer to that is no. If you are just after a Poly Aftertouch keyboard, I think something like the Waldorf Blofeld keys or any of the older Ensoniq synthesizers that have Poly Aftertouch would probably be a more budget-friendly choice. However, with that said, if you have the money for it, it would be a hell of a choice for a Poly Aftertouch keyboard because it's also got a pretty ridiculous synthesizer attached, but I think solely as a Poly Aftertouch keyboard, your money is probably better spent elsewhere. The next big one, how does it compare to the Novation Peak here? Well, the Hydrasynth and the Peak occupy some pretty similar territory. In terms of price, the Hydrasynth keys comes in at $12.99, whereas the Novation Peak is $13.99. The Hydrasynth desktop, however, comes in at $7.99. The Peak has 3 oscillators, all of which can be wavetable oscillators, whereas the Hydrasynth only has 2. The Hydrasynth has mutants, whereas the Peak does not. The Peak has an analog filter, the Hydrasynth does not. In terms of effects, the Hydrasynth's got a bit more going on, but the Peak maybe has a better reverb algorithm overall, but I think that's not super important because you don't typically buy a synth for its effects. Other big differences, the Peak does not support MPE, the Hydrasynth does. The Peak does not offer voice panning, and the Hydrasynth does. The Peak only allows you to do voice panning in unison mode, whereas the Hydrasynth can have the voices spread out in the stereo field in the regular poly mode, which is kind of cool. I do wish Novation would add that to the Peak at some point. After jamming with the Hydrasynth and the Peak both hooked up and having them right side by side, I feel like they complement each other really well. There are some differences between them and they both supplement, I think, each other's weaknesses while both having their own very unique strengths. I think probably they're both worth getting, but either one would be a really good choice if you're just not sure which one to get. I think at the end of the day, I find myself personally preferring the sound of the Peak, but that is probably just entirely personal bias. I've had the Peak for a while now. I've really loved it ever since I've got it, and it's served me so well on so many projects. I feel like the Hydrasynth, though, would easily be an equally fun and useful synth to own. So again, both really, really good choices. The next comparison I was asked to make, how does it stack up against the Waldorf Blofeld? Because this comes in a lot cheaper, especially the desktop version. There are some pretty big differences, but there are, once again, a lot of similarities, I think. From what I gathered online, some people seem to think of the Hydrasynth as a modern Blofeld, and I think in a way that's correct, but I don't think it's really accurate at the end of the day. The Hydrasynth is kind of its own unique beast, and the Blofeld is just kind of in another category. Both the Hydrasynth and the Blofeld occupy a sort of similar territory in that they are both very digital wavetable synth things, but in terms of the overall sound, I think sonically they're just very, very different, and there isn't really a comparison between the two besides maybe some of the more traditional patches and whatnot. With that being said, I think the Blofeld offers a lot of what the Hydrasynth does. Obviously, the Hydrasynth has some really unique features that are exclusive to that, but between the two, I think you could get some pretty similar sonic flavors, and the Blofeld is quite a bit cheaper. The Hydrasynth supports MPE, as mentioned, against the peak. The Blofeld does not, but the Blofeld is multi-timbral, whereas the Hydrasynth does not. To me, that's a big advantage. I really like the multi-timbral features of the Blofeld, and I really like multi-timbral synths in general, just to get some pretty complex sounds going. But again, I think both are pretty good choices overall, and given that the Blofeld, especially secondhand, is so cheap, if you really want them, I would probably just get both. You could get a desktop Hydrasynth and a desktop Blofeld for not a whole lot of money and have a pretty formidable synth setup with those two. The biggest difference I can think of, though, is that the Blofeld has some pretty crappy effects, whereas the effects on the Hydrasynth are pretty good, and in terms of build quality, the Hydrasynth is definitely more well-made than the Blofeld. The Blofeld is pretty notorious for some encoder issues and other little things, and the Blofeld being quite a bit older, there are some bugs and weirdness to it that aren't likely to be resolved anytime soon, if ever, whereas ASM seems to be pretty on top of their game in making sure the Hydrasynth is the best thing it can be, as well as even adding new features in firmware updates. Another really big question, is the ASM Hydrasynth a good choice for a first synthesizer? I think it is a hell of a choice for a first synthesizer. It is incredibly powerful, and I think that's thanks to it being a pretty recent synthesizer. It is really, really deep, really, really powerful, and really, really cool. That said, it is a bit on the more premium side in terms of price. If you do have the money to get a Hydrasynth, I think if you are just starting your hardware synth setup or collection, the Hydrasynth is a good core unit. It lays a lot of foundation and does a lot of different things, so I think if it's your first hardware synth, it's a good choice because you wouldn't be bored easily. Whenever people are looking for a first hardware synth, I never recommend something that's like a basic analog monosynth or basic analog polysynth, because I feel like those get pretty restrictive pretty fast, and people coming from the world of the DAW and plugins and all that plugins can do can get pretty underwhelmed by the world of hardware. But the Hydrasynth, I think, is a really good choice to bridge that gap, because it does a lot of what you would expect a VST to do while offering you the hardware workflow and a lot of features for the price. There are a lot of cheaper choices out there. The Blofeld is usually kind of my go-to recommendation as a first synthesizer because it's so insanely powerful for the money, but there's lots of other things out there like the Micro Monster. There's stuff like the Modal Argon 8M, I think would be an equally good choice. But if you can save up the cash or really want something that's a solid core investment, the Hydrasynth would probably be a very solid choice all around. Another super common question, should I get the keybed version or the desktop version? And I don't think I can answer this for you. If you already have a MIDI controller that's a decent MIDI controller, probably not worth getting the keys version unless you like all of the extra knobs and would like a poly aftertouch keybed and have the space to deal with that. I personally work out of a pretty small space, and I generally don't like keybed synths. I think they just take up way too much space, and I would rather just have a nicer MIDI controller and control them that way. Is it easy to use? I think it is surprisingly fast and intuitive given how deep the synthesizer is. As you may have noticed if you checked out the live stream of my first impressions, I feel like I was pretty quickly able to figure out a lot of things about the Hydrasynth and what it did and what it could do and what it was capable of, as well as, you know, just by digging through some of the factory patches, hearing some of the sounds and listening carefully to what's going on and trying to understand what may be causing that, and then being able to intuitively dive into that and use that for my own patch design. It is pretty deep and there is a fair amount of menu diving involved, and like I said, it's really nice to take advantage of the mod matrix, so good patches do take a lot of time, but I think the layout and buttons and everything about it is so well designed that all that menu diving and parameter assigning and whatnot doesn't get in the way of enjoying the experience of making patches on the Hydrasynth. Is it warm? I would say yes and no. The Hydrasynth has a bit of a character to it. It has some really, really good filters, and I think much like the Blofeld, once you start applying a bit of filter drive, it sounds really, really good. I think it does a lot of those classic subtractive analog style patches very, very well. It is not the warmest, lushest synth I have ever heard, but as I mentioned, in a mix and whatnot, and with a little bit of post-processing, I cannot complain whatsoever about the sound of the Hydrasynth. When you are building patches, there is also the warm mode, which I think When you're building patches, there is also the warm mode, which I do think helps a bit. You can also add some drift and whatnot to the oscillators, much like you can on the Novation Peak, which similarly with the Peak, that does help a lot to warm the sound up and make it feel a bit more like a traditional analog type synth or more premium virtual analog type synth. So overall, it does a pretty good job at a lot of the warm, lush sounds, but it also really gets into crazy, harsh, cold, icy digital territory just as easily. And I think, in my opinion, that's a pretty good value. It can do both things very well, so you're not buying two different things to do those two different things. You can do it all pretty well with one synth. One thing worth noting about warmth and the Hydrasynth though is that I feel like it gets away from you pretty quickly once you start changing to some of the other filter types, and especially once you get into wavetables and whatnot, it really starts to lose that warmth pretty quickly. But with a bit of EQ and whatnot, it's not that hard to resolve. I think in the end though, it's important to manage expectations. Again, the Hydrasynth is a digital, fully digital all the way through synth, and it is a wavetable, wave shaping, super complex oscillator type synth, so it is going to sound like a digital synthesizer would sound. But if you're using just saws, squares, triangles, that kind of stuff with, traditional ladder filters and a bit of filter drive, it does a very good job at classic sounds. Finally, I think the most important question of them all, does it make my wallet hurt? Personally, I'm a bit torn on this, and I don't really know. I have very thoroughly enjoyed my time with the Hydrasynth, but at this point in time, I don't personally see myself buying one, and that's because with what I already have, I feel like there's so much feature overlap that there's not anything that I personally am going to gain from owning a Hydrasynth. With that said, if I was buying my first big synthesizer today, if I didn't own my Novation Peak, for example, I think the Hydrasynth would be at the top of my list, and that is purely in just terms of pragmatism. It does a lot of different things, and that for me is the best investment for my money. Some people might want something that is an analog synth or whatever. I just want the synth that does the most features for a decent, feature to price ratio, and the Hydrasynth delivers a whole lot for not a ridiculous amount of money. I think it is a great choice to start off your hardware setup with and will keep you very busy for a long time. I've queued up Voltage Modular in the background here to give us a lovely generative ambient soundscape from the Hydrasynth to play us out. So yeah, that has been my time with the ASM Hydrasynth over the last couple of weeks. It's been a lot of fun to explore this thing and see what it's capable of. It was really surprising, and it really was just a lot of fun. This is an incredibly powerful, capable instrument, and for as deep as it is very friendly to use, which is great to see. I think it's awesome that something that does so much doesn't require reading a manual for hours and hours and hours to get to know it. You can simply pick it up, play with it, and start making awesome music. Big thank you again to ASM for hooking me up with the Hydrasynth here for the last couple of weeks. It's been a lot of fun to explore. I've had a great time doing it, and I'm gonna be sad to see it go, but I will treasure the memories dear in my heart for years to come. What do you think of the Hydrasynth? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys again soon.